In the outer reaches of the Andromeda Spiral, where common sense goes to die and evolution apparently has a twisted sense of humor, exists a world that serves as the galaxy's collective reminder that some places are better left unexplored. Vorthak Prime, home to the Draconian Apex Predators, enjoys the distinguished reputation of being the galaxy's collective nightmare fuel the planet's tourism board gave up decades ago, and even the most adventurous interstellar travel guides simply marked it with a skull emoji and moved on. The Draconians themselves are what happens when evolution decides to throw subtlety out the airlock and go absolutely mad with the concept of apex predator. Standing 12 feet tall on their hind legs, covered in scales that could deflect plasma cannons, and possessing claws that make surgical scalpels look like butter knives, they represent the kind of biological engineering that makes other species question their life choices. Their breath doesn't just burn, it incinerates matter at the molecular level, leaving behind nothing but regret and a faint smell of ozone. For the past 3 millennia, every major galactic power has maintained a simple policy regarding Vorthak Prime: avoid it like a plague-infested space station having a bad day. The Draconians, for their part, seem perfectly content with this arrangement. They've never shown interest in conquest, colonization, or even basic diplomacy. They simply exist on their world, being magnificently terrifying and occasionally devouring the occasional fool who mistakes their planet for a vacation destination. The Terran research vessel Discovery, operated by the relatively new human species, had been conducting what its crew optimistically called deep space xenobiology surveys, and what everyone else called dangerous curiosity with government funding. Humans, as it turns out, possess a remarkable talent for finding trouble in the most unlikely places, often while insisting they're simply being thorough researchers. The ship's captain, a woman whose confidence far exceeded her common sense, had decided that Vorthak Prime represented an unprecedented opportunity for scientific advancement. Her crew, being human, had somehow convinced themselves that their advanced shielding and diplomatic protocols would be sufficient protection against creatures that had made entire star systems collectively decide to take the long way around. The Discovery's journey to Vorthak Prime had proceeded smoothly right up until the moment it didn't. A cascade failure in the ship's main drive system, triggered by what the chief engineer would later describe as a particularly aggressive space rock with attitude problems, had resulted in an emergency landing that could be generously described as catastrophic, and more accurately called a controlled explosion with delusions of being a landing. The crash site painted a picture of spectacular failure across a crystalline valley. Twisted metal, scattered equipment, and the occasional small fire dotted the landscape like a modern art installation titled Human Hubris Meets Physical Reality. The ship's emergency beacon broadcasted its distress signal into the void, though given their current location, the chances of rescue seemed roughly equivalent to winning the Galactic lottery while being struck by lightning. Among the wreckage, a small figure moved with the determined purpose of someone who had clearly missed the memo about their current predicament. The boy, perhaps 10 years old by human standards, picked his way through the debris with the careful attention of someone looking for something specific. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face smudged with soot, but his expression remained one of focused concentration rather than panic. The child had survived the crash through a combination of luck, youth's remarkable resilience, and the fact that he'd been strapped into the ship's most reinforced section when everything went sideways. While the adult crew members had been considerably less fortunate, the boy had emerged with nothing more than bruises and a profound sense of displacement. He paused beside a partially crushed storage compartment, his small hands working to free a brightly colored object from the twisted metal. After several minutes of determined effort, he extracted a children's book, its pages slightly singed but otherwise intact. The cover depicted cheerful cartoon animals engaged in what appeared to be a tea party, an image so incongruously peaceful in their current circumstances that it seemed like a cosmic joke. The boy settled himself on a relatively flat piece of debris, opened the book, and began reading aloud in the tone of someone who had clearly done this many times before. His voice carried across the crystalline valley, a small human sound in an alien landscape that had never heard such things. What the boy couldn't see, hidden among the crystalline formations that surrounded the crash site, were the eyes that had been watching him since the moment his ship had fallen from the sky. Pairs of golden, predatory eyes that belonged to creatures whose very existence had shaped galactic politics for millennia. The Draconians had detected the ship's approach long before it had entered their atmosphere. They'd watched its descent with the detached interest of apex predators observing potential prey. The crash had been unexpected. Ships didn't usually fall from the sky in pieces, though they supposed it saved them the trouble of shooting it down themselves. Now, as they observed this small alien creature sitting among the wreckage, reading from what appeared to be some sort of data pad, they found themselves in the unusual position of being genuinely puzzled. In their considerable experience, crash survivors typically spent their time screaming, running, or attempting to repair their vessels. This one seemed to be talking to itself. The pack leader, a magnificent specimen whose scales gleamed like polished obsidian, tilted her massive head as she considered the situation. Her intelligence, while focused primarily on hunting and territorial defense, was considerable. She could smell the fear that should have been radiating from the small alien, but instead detected only calmness. Contentment, even. This was unprecedented. The other members of her pack shifted restlessly in their concealed positions, uncertain how to process this deviation from established patterns. Small aliens were food. This was a fundamental truth of their existence, yet this particular small alien seemed entirely unaware of this fact, continuing its strange vocalization ritual with apparent satisfaction. The pack leader made a decision that would have surprised every xenobiologist in the galaxy. Rather than immediately eliminating the potential threat, she chose to observe. After all, this small creature would be just as dead in 10 minutes as it would be now, and her curiosity had been piqued. The boy continued reading, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of practiced storytelling, completely oblivious to the fact that the galaxy's most feared predators were debating whether to eat him or simply continue being confused by his existence. As the twin suns of Vorthak Prime began to set, casting long shadows across the crystalline valley, the stage was set for an encounter that would challenge everything the galaxy thought it knew about humans, Draconians, and the power of a good bedtime story. The pack leader's patience, which had lasted approximately 15 minutes longer than anyone in the galaxy would have considered reasonable, finally reached its limit. She emerged from her crystalline hiding place with the fluid grace of a nightmare-given physical form, her massive frame casting a shadow that could have eclipsed small moons. The sound of her claws clicking against the crystal formations echoed through the valley like a death knell with rhythm. Her pack followed suit, 6 more specimens of evolutionary excess materializing from their concealment with the coordinated precision of apex predators who had perfected the art of being absolutely terrifying. They moved in a loose circle around the crash site, their golden eyes fixed on the small human figure who continued his incomprehensible vocal ritual, apparently oblivious to the fact that certain death was now surrounding him with professional efficiency. The boy looked up from his book as the first shadow fell across his makeshift reading spot, his eyes wide with what any reasonable observer would have assumed was terror, instead reflected something that the Draconians had never encountered in their considerable experience with prey species: genuine curiosity, mixed with what appeared to be sympathy. "Oh," the boy said, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had just noticed something mildly interesting, rather than the shriek of existential terror that the situation clearly warranted. "You all look really sad." The pack leader's massive head tilted to one side, a gesture that would have been almost comical if it hadn't been performed by a creature capable of melting starship hulls with her breath. In her 3 centuries of existence, she had been called many things by various species: terrifying, magnificent, apocalyptic, and occasionally that thing that made me wet myself, but never sad. "Are you lonely?" the boy continued, apparently interpreting their predatory stillness as emotional distress rather than the careful calculation of efficient killing techniques. "You must be, living way out here by yourselves with no one to talk to." The youngest member of the pack, a mere century-old specimen whose scales still held the bright gleam of youth, made a sound that might have been confusion if apex predators were capable of such mundane emotions. The pack leader silenced him with a look that could have frozen supernovas. The boy stood up, still clutching his book, and approached the pack leader with the fearless confidence of someone who had clearly never received the standard galactic education regarding things that could incinerate him without breaking a sweat. The Draconians tensed, their predatory instincts screaming warnings about unpredictable prey behavior, but found themselves oddly reluctant to simply end the encounter. "My name's Tommy," the boy announced, extending his hand in what the pack leader dimly recognized as some sort of greeting ritual. "I was reading stories. Would you like to hear one? They're really good stories about friendship and adventures." The pack leader stared at the small appendage being offered to her, trying to process this unprecedented situation through the lens of her considerable but specialized intelligence. In her experience, small creatures either ran screaming or stood frozen in terror when confronted with her presence. They did not offer social interaction or suggest recreational activities. Tommy seemed to interpret her silence as agreement, which demonstrated either remarkable optimism or a complete disconnection from reality. He returned to his seat on the debris and opened his book again, patting the ground beside him in a gesture that clearly invited the galaxy's most feared predators to join him for story time. "This one's about a little rabbit who makes friends with a fox," Tommy began, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who had read many bedtime stories. "The rabbit was scared at first because everyone told him foxes were dangerous, but it turned out the fox was just misunderstood." The pack leader found herself moving closer, despite every instinct screaming that this situation violated the fundamental laws of predator-prey relationships. The other members of her pack followed, drawn by a combination of curiosity and the hypnotic quality of the human's voice. "The fox had been lonely for a very long time," Tommy continued, apparently unaware that his audience consisted of creatures whose breath could melt titanium. "All the other animals ran away whenever they saw him, so he never had anyone to play with or talk to. He spent his days walking through the forest by himself, wishing he had a friend." The youngest Draconian crept closer, his massive form moving with surprising stealth. The pack leader noted this breach of protocol but found herself oddly reluctant to enforce discipline. The human's voice had a quality she couldn't identify, something warm and rhythmic that seemed to bypass her predatory analysis systems entirely. "But the little rabbit was different," Tommy said, turning a page with the careful attention of someone who had heard this story many times but still found it engaging. "He wasn't afraid of the fox's sharp teeth or his big paws. He saw that the fox's eyes were sad, and he decided to be brave." The pack leader settled onto the crystalline ground, her massive form surprisingly graceful despite her size. The action was entirely unconscious, driven by some instinct she didn't recognize. Around her, the other members of her pack followed suit, creating a circle of apex predators whose attention was focused entirely on a small human child and his colorful book. The rabbit walked right up to the fox and said, "Hello, I'm Benny. You look like you could use a friend." Tommy read, his voice taking on different tones for the different characters. The fox was so surprised that he forgot to be scary. No one had ever wanted to be his friend before. The youngest Draconian made a soft sound that might have been contentment if such emotions were possible for his species. The pack leader shot him a warning look, but found that her heart wasn't really in it. The human's story was oddly compelling, so they became the best of friends, Tommy continued, completely absorbed in his tale. They played together every day, and the fox learned that being different didn't mean being alone. The other animals saw how happy they were and realized they had been wrong about foxes. The pack leader found herself leaning forward slightly, her massive head lowering until she was at eye level with the small human. Tommy looked up and smiled at her, apparently seeing nothing unusual about having a conversation with a creature that represented the concentrated nightmares of an entire galaxy. "The fox and the rabbit went on lots of adventures together," Tommy said, returning to his book. "They helped other animals who were lonely or scared, and they showed everyone that friendship can happen between the most unlikely creatures." The pack leader felt something stirring in her chest that she couldn't identify. It wasn't hunger, which was her usual response to small creatures. It wasn't territorial aggression, which was her default setting for most situations. It was something else entirely, something warm and strange that she had no frame of reference for. "And they lived happily ever after," Tommy concluded, closing the book with a satisfied sigh. "That's one of my favorite stories. Do you want to hear another one?" The pack leader looked around at her pack, noting that they were all staring at the human with expressions of what could only be described as rapt attention. The youngest member actually nodded eagerly, apparently forgetting that he was supposed to be a terrifying apex predator rather than an enthusiastic audience member. The situation had devolved so far from standard predator-prey dynamics that the pack leader found herself in completely uncharted territory. Every instinct told her to simply eliminate the small alien and restore the natural order, but something about the human's voice and stories had created a cognitive dissonance that her predatory psychology couldn't resolve. "I have lots of books," Tommy said, reaching into the wreckage to extract several more colorful volumes. "This one's about a dragon who learns to share, and this one's about a princess who saves herself. Oh, and this one's about a little boy who makes friends with monsters." The pack leader's eyes widened slightly at the mention of dragons, though she couldn't quite process why this seemed significant. The human child continued sorting through his books, with the careful attention of someone selecting the perfect story for his audience, apparently treating the galaxy's most feared predators as nothing more than an eager group of listeners. As the sons of Vorthak Prime continued their descent toward the horizon, the most unprecedented scene in galactic history continued to unfold. A human child reading bedtime stories to creatures that had made entire civilizations develop alternative travel routes, while said creatures found themselves genuinely interested in tales of friendship and adventure. The boy selected another book and opened it with the practiced ease of someone who had clearly done this many times before, completely unaware that he was in the process of accidentally revolutionizing interspecies relations through the simple act of treating the galaxy's boogeyman as potential friends. What followed could only be described as the most surreal book club meeting in galactic history. Tommy had settled into his role as storyteller, with the natural confidence of someone who had clearly never been informed that his audience consisted of living weapons of mass destruction. He opened his second book, a tale about a lonely dragon who learned the value of friendship, and began reading with the same enthusiasm he might have shown to a group of classmates. The pack leader found herself in the unprecedented position of being genuinely invested in the outcome of a story about a dragon who felt misunderstood by the local villagers. The irony was not lost on her, though she lacked the cultural context to fully appreciate it. She leaned closer to better hear Tommy's voice, her massive head now resting on the crystalline ground at an angle that allowed her to see the colorful illustrations. "The dragon tried to make friends with the villagers," Tommy read, his finger tracing the pictures as he spoke. "But every time he approached their town, they would run away screaming. The dragon thought maybe it was because his scales were too dark, or his roar was too loud, or maybe he just wasn't good enough to be anyone's friend." The youngest pack member made a sound that was dangerously close to a whimper, earning him a sharp look from the pack leader. However, she found that her disciplinary instincts were mysteriously muted. The human story was touching on themes that resonated in ways her predatory psychology couldn't quite process. Approximately 300 light-years away, the crew of a galactic patrol vessel detected the emergency beacon from the crashed human ship. Captain Zegsython, a veteran of the infamous Rigel border conflicts, reviewed the distress signal with the weary resignation of someone who had seen too many rescue missions end badly. "Vorthak Prime," his navigator announced, her voice carrying the tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "The signal is coming from Vorthak Prime." The bridge fell silent, except for the gentle hum of life support systems. Zegsython rubbed his temples with his forearms, a gesture that indicated stress levels approaching the critical point. In his 40 years of service, he had never encountered a situation quite this hopeless. "How long since the crash?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would only make things worse. "Approximately 4 hours, sir," the navigator replied. "The signal strength suggests at least partial survival of the vessel's emergency systems." Zegsython considered the implications. 4 hours was more than enough time for the Draconians to have discovered the crash site and dealt with any survivors in their characteristically efficient manner. Still, regulations required him to investigate distress signals, even when said investigation was likely to yield nothing more than a cautionary tale and some interesting scorch marks. "Set course for Vorthak Prime," he ordered, the words feeling like a death sentence. "Maximum stealth approach. We'll scan for survivors from a safe distance and, well, see what's left." Back on the planet's surface, Tommy had finished the dragon story and was now explaining the plot of his next selection to his attentive audience. The pack leader found herself genuinely curious about the outcome of a tale involving a princess who decided to rescue herself from a tower rather than wait for assistance. She looked out the window and saw how high up she was, Tommy read, his voice taking on the tone of someone describing a particularly clever solution to a difficult problem. But instead of being scared, she got an idea. She took all the fancy dresses in the closet and tied them together to make a rope. The pack leader's analytical mind, trained for hunting strategy and territorial defense, found itself engaged by the princess's problem-solving approach. The concept of using available resources to overcome obstacles was one she could appreciate, even if the context was entirely foreign to her experience. The other members of her pack had arranged themselves in a rough semicircle around Tommy, their massive forms creating a protective barrier that they weren't consciously aware of forming. The youngest member had actually moved close enough that Tommy was now leaning against his scaled flank while reading, apparently finding the warmth comfortable. The princess climbed down her dress rope and escaped from the tower all by herself, Tommy continued, turning the page with the careful attention of someone who had read this story many times but still found it engaging. When the prince arrived to rescue her, she was already free and having tea with the dragon, who lived nearby. The pack leader's eyes widened slightly at this plot development. A dragon who lived nearby and had tea with escaped princesses? This was a level of social interaction she had never considered possible for her species. The dragon wasn't scary at all, Tommy read, his voice warm with approval. He was just lonely and wanted someone to talk to. The princess and the dragon became great friends, and they went on adventures together all over the kingdom. The concept of adventures that didn't involve hunting or territorial disputes was so foreign to the pack leader that she found herself struggling to process it. Yet something about the idea appealed to her in ways she couldn't identify. Tommy closed the book and looked up at his audience with the satisfied expression of someone who had just shared something wonderful. "That's another one of my favorites. The princess didn't wait for someone else to solve her problems, and she made friends with someone everyone else was afraid of." The pack leader felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with her internal combustion systems. The human child stories were creating emotional responses that she had no framework for understanding, yet they felt right, somehow. "Do you have names?" Tommy asked suddenly, apparently realizing that he had been talking to his audience for over an hour without proper introductions. "I'm Tommy, but I already told you that. What should I call you?" The pack leader stared at the small human, trying to process this question. In her species, names were territorial markers, indicators of hunting grounds and bloodline hierarchies. The concept of names as social identifiers for the purpose of friendly interaction was completely alien to her experience. Yet as she looked at Tommy's expectant face, she found herself wanting to participate in this strange ritual. The human had shared his stories, his warmth, his apparent assumption that she and her pack were worthy of friendship. Something in her wanted to reciprocate. She made a low, rumbling sound that indicated acknowledgement among her kind. Tommy tilted his head, apparently trying to interpret the vocalization. "Is that your name?" he asked. "It's very pretty. Can you say mine?" The pack leader attempted to reproduce the sounds Tommy with her vocal apparatus, which was designed more for intimidation than conversation. The result was a deep, resonant approximation that sounded like distant thunder, mixed with the echo of vast caverns. Tommy clapped his hands together, apparently delighted by this development. "That's perfect. You have a beautiful voice. It's like music but bigger." The pack leader felt something that might have been pride, though she had no experience with pride that wasn't related to successful hunts or territorial dominance. This was different, warmer, more connected to the small human's obvious pleasure in their interaction. The youngest pack member, emboldened by this exchange, attempted his own vocalization. Tommy turned to him with the same enthusiastic attention, apparently treating each attempt at communication as a precious gift. As the evening progressed, the most feared predators in the galaxy found themselves engaged in what could only be described as a social gathering. They listened to stories about friendship and adventure, attempted to communicate with their human guest, and experienced emotions that their species had never developed names for. High above the planet, Captain Zexathan's ship approached the outer atmosphere, its sensors sweeping the surface for signs of life. What they detected made the crew question their equipment, then their sanity, then their understanding of fundamental physics. "Sir," the sensor operator announced, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just witnessed the impossible. "I'm reading multiple draconian life signs, and they appear to be stationary, in a group formation, with a human life sign in the center." Zexathan stared at the readings, trying to process information that violated everything he knew about draconian behavior. "The human is still alive?" "Yes, sir. And the draconians, they're not moving in hunting patterns, they're just sitting there, around the human." The bridge crew exchanged glances that conveyed a mixture of confusion and terror. In all recorded history, there had never been a report of draconians exhibiting peaceful behavior toward other species. The implications were staggering. "Take us closer," Zexon ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. "But maintain maximum stealth. We need to understand what we're seeing." Down on the planet's surface, Tommy was beginning his fourth story of the evening, apparently unaware that he was in the process of accidentally rewriting the fundamental assumptions of galactic diplomacy through the simple act of treating the galaxy's most feared predators as potential friends who just needed someone to read them bedtime stories. Captain Zexathan's ship descended through Vorthak Prime's atmosphere, sensors detecting the impossible 7 Draconian Apex Predators arranged protectively around a single human child. "Sir," the communications officer whispered, "I'm picking up audio transmissions. The human appears to be reading stories." Instead of desperate pleas, the bridge speakers filled with Tommy's voice, and the little mouse realized that the big scary bear wasn't scary at all, just lonely. The bridge crew stared in bewilderment. The galaxy's most feared predators were listening to bedtime stories like an attentive audience. Tommy spotted their cloaked vessel and waved cheerfully. "Hello up there, I'm okay, I've made some new friends." "Friends," Zixon repeated weakly. "He's made friends with the Draconians." Tommy continued reading about dragons who become librarians. "The boy has accidentally created the most effective diplomatic contact in galactic history," the science officer observed. The pack leader listened intently as Tommy asked, "Would you like to hear another story?" "I think I'd like that very much," she replied, her voice a deep rumble that somehow conveyed warmth. Captain Zexon made the difficult decision to maintain position and observe. The boy was safe, the Draconians were peaceful, and the universe had rewritten its own rules through bedtime stories. As Vorthak Prime's twin suns set, Tommy continued reading, the galaxy's most feared predators had discovered the warmth of friendship and the joy of shared stories. The universe had a sense of humor after all. It had taken a crashed spaceship, children's books, and one small human boy to teach the galaxy that sometimes the most effective diplomacy comes from treating others with kindness. Tommy yawned and prepared for sleep, having accidentally revolutionized interspecies relations. The pack leader curled around him protectively, keeping watch through the night. When news networks reported the impossible story, most beings would assume it was a hoax. But those who knew the truth would remember it as the day the universe reminded everyone that the most profound changes come from simple acts of genuine kindness, performed by those too young to know that what they're doing is supposed to be impossible.